I'll get started in just a minute or two. I'm going to give it a little extra time for people to log in tonight if we have any others. FYI, SpaceX launched their Starship prototype today, and it stuck the landing. And then about 5 minutes after it stuck the landing, it exploded. So it's been an interesting afternoon here because I'm all about watching some SpaceX. You know what? I'm just going to go ahead and get started. People can tune in if they want. Some people watch it the next day. You know how it is. Anyway, so tonight we're going to be taking a look at the well-known encounter in John 4 with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well in the town of Sychar, whatever. And that town where she is located at is about 1 mile from the ancient town of Shechem, which is an important town in the history of Israel. When you go back into the Old Testament and you look around, you can see that Shechem is the first place where Abraham stops after entering Canaan in Genesis 12:6. It's the place of covenant renewal for Israel towards the end of the leadership of Joshua. And you see that big meeting taking place in Joshua 24, and the burial place of Joseph in Joshua 24:32. The bones of Joseph was located in that particular. They buried him there. Jacob was also buried there before him. Anyway, a lot of people were buried. This was an important location. And Sychar was the location of the well that Jacob owned. And that well is referenced as ground zero for this particular account. By the way, in case you're wondering what Anna is saying in the chat, I have hidden a small Ant-Man figure in the background somewhere. So if you can find it, you win my respect. So good luck. Anyway, so this Jacob's well is the ground zero for this particular account. And Jesus, in this account, like in John 4:10, he offers the woman at the well living water. Jesus said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would give you living water." Well, Jesus is referring to spiritual refreshment as opposed to merely physical water. And when he talks about living water, it's a metaphor for salvation. But it's interesting to note that the idea or the term living water also in that culture refers to fresh running water, the water of a stream, the water of a artesian well, or something to something to that effect. And interestingly enough, the town of Sychar sits on top of an aquifer that is the largest source of fresh water in the region. So the area in and of itself, because of that, had roughly 80 springs around the small town. But Jacob used a well to access this fresh living water rather than one of the natural springs. It may have something to do with the fact that he was a foreigner and The Canaanites that were already there had the land, so he had to purchase the land, and it probably didn't have a water source, so because that was precious, so he had to dig a well. Anyway, the living water that Jesus offers is greater than even the most refreshing, running, fresh living water that you can think of. It meets true needs, spiritual needs, rather than just physical needs. But when you're looking at this particular encounter in John chapter 4 with the woman at the well, it brings to light really the strained relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans, which makes what Jesus does in this account very shocking, because he, for the first time, as recorded in the book of John, and probably chronologically in the Gospels, the earliest revelation of his identity of Messiah to a random woman is what makes this remarkable. Take a look at the culmination of this particular event in John chapter 4, 25 and 26. The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." So a shocking revelation here, but here's what makes this so remarkable, and what I find fascinating about this particular account. Beyond the fact that it's the earliest explicit mention by Jesus of his messianic role, but B, and most importantly, that it was not said to a male Jew in good standing, but rather to a woman who is from one of the detested Samaritan tribes. So what I want to do today is consider this really surprising encounter, and I want to examine the origin of the Samaritans and the depth of the animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans that existed in Jesus' day and how they got there, so that we can better appreciate the magnitude of this moment when we look at it in detail next week. So let's start by taking a look at the account. When you take a look at this account, verses 1 through 6 it sets up the account, the scenario. It deals with the, why Jesus traveled to this small town, why, what is going on here. And in verses 7 through 9, you see the shocking demand. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 6. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. And he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. So what we have here, we've already discussed this little town and the well and the importance of that water. But the most interesting thing that you see in that text takes place in verse 4. And he had to pass through Samaria. Now, there were generally two routes to Samaria. The longer route, which was preferred by rigid, staunch Jews for purity reasons in order to avoid defiling themselves by traveling through Samaria, would be to cross over the Jordan. Let's say you're going from Jerusalem up to Galilee, or from Galilee down to Jerusalem. Well, if you're going from Jerusalem to Galilee, what you do is you go over from Jerusalem to the area where Jericho was located, just above the Red Sea, or the Dead Sea, and then cross over to the other side of the Jordan, and then travel along that ridge, and then till you get to, all the way to the, past the area of Samaria, and then you cut back over into Galilee across the Jordan. And they would basically go into the Transjordan just to sidestep, the area of Samaria because of their disdain for the Samaritans. There was a quicker path and the more direct path, and that's the path that Jesus took. And here is the picture. Here's the route that he took. Now, It's believed Jesus was somewhere in the Judean countryside. You can use Jerusalem in that particular area as a starting point if you want. And then he's going to travel just in almost a direct line up to the town of Sychar and where Jacob's well is located. And he doesn't cross over into the Transjordan area. Rather, he just goes straight up the map. Now, Josephus advocated this particular route to his own people. When he wrote this, he actually wrote this particular quote. He said, "I wrote to my friends in Samaria to take care that they might safely pass through the country. For Samaria was already under the Romans, and it was absolutely necessary for those that go quickly to Jerusalem to pass through that country. For in that road you may, in 3 days' time, go from Galilee to Jerusalem." So it was quicker. But it wasn't without its own dangers. The Samaritans would occasionally attack and bushwhack Jews that were traveling from Jerusalem to Galilee, Galilee to Jerusalem to observe these annual feasts and things of that nature. So there was an element of danger to it, but it was also substantially quicker than cutting over and going up. So here is the real question about this particular text, and that is, why did Jesus, as the text say, have to go that route? Some translations read something to the effect of, I must go that way, or I have need to go that way, something to that effect. The text suggests that this was not a matter of just personal option, but rather a matter of compulsion or a matter of necessity, which is what the word that is translated "have to" in English means, the Greek word itself. It's often used of divine necessity. We see it in John 3:14, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must," you get the idea, "the Son of Man be lifted up." There was divine necessity in that particular act. John 20:29, you see divine necessity in that same phrase again, that same Greek word, and that says, "For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead." I have to go, he must. You get the idea. So must the Son of Man be lifted up. It speaks to divine necessity in the book of John, oftentimes when you find it. And because of that particular fact, many people have suggested that the route that was taken there was out of providential necessity, because there was this providentially appointed encounter with this particular Samaritan woman. And they will point to the fact that Philip, in the book of Acts, chapter 8, had a providentially appointed encounter with the Ethiopian eunuch, and he was instructed to go there and do that. They would suggest that Jesus was under the same instruction or being compelled to go that way in order to meet some providential encounter. But I'm going to say, and that's a very common phrase, and when I looked at various commentaries, most of the commentaries I saw pushed for that particular perspective. But in reality, that's really a subjective reading of the text, and it really can't be proven from the text itself. There's another possibility, and the one that I hold is directly tied to the text itself. When you go back to the text, look at the very beginning of why Jesus is leaving the area and going north. It says, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was making and baptizing more disciples than John, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. He left. What seems to be the point here, and the position that I take, isn't so much that there was a providential encounter to be had with the Samaritan woman, but that the pressure from the religious leaders quickly becoming aware of Jesus' growing ministry necessitated a quick departure from that particular area, and the quickest path isn't to cross over into the Transjordan where he might have encountered some Pharisees traveling up and down the road, but rather to go through the area of Samaria, the quickest way to Galilee, even though he does delay in this town for a couple of days as he teaches people and finds, good reception there. So it's much easier for me to, to support that particular position from the text than to simply just say, read a little too much into the he had to pass through Samaria. It could just be a matter of the situation was such that it dictated that he had to go that way. He was compelled to go that way, as it was the fastest way out of the area where trouble was starting to spark up. So you can't really prove either way here. That's the position that I lean towards. I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, and I'm reluctant to make a mountain out of a molehill over an odd saying in one verse, unlike a ton of other commentators that tend to do that. So that's where we're at. But the point is, Jesus is now in the town of Sychar, and he is going to be he's going to be having a discussion with the woman. Says in verse 6 that he arrived there about the 6th hour, and as Jews reckon time, that is right at noon. So he showed up around lunchtime, around the middle of the day. Then that leads us to really the point that we're going to be dealing with tonight, and that is the shocking demand of Jesus, and why this demand that he makes of this random Samaritan woman is so shocking in light of the cultural baggage that is tied to Jew and Samaritan relations. Take a look at verses 7 through 9. A woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Now that last little bit, the ESV translators see that as a editorial insertion by the author, the Apostle John, and I believe that that's a fair assessment of that. But anyway, you see, and I'm going to leave this text up for a few minutes while I talk. Jesus and his entourage arrives at the town of Sychar around noon, and he encounters a woman drawing water from this particular famous well. Now, how many of you have heard people speculate as to why she was here at noon? There's no shortage of people who are willing to throw this woman under the bus. She's a woman of ill repute, or she would have been there earlier in the day with the other women to draw water. I've seen that put forward in numerous commentaries. And this woman is disparaged, assumes the worst of her character on the basis of her being at the well at a time when most others would not be. You see, they tend to see a woman of ill repute in town, thus she goes at lunchtime in sort of this way to self-ostracize herself from the community. But are we to really believe that there are no other valid reasons for drawing water in the heat of the day? I can think of 3 or 4 just off the top of my head. Perhaps the stone jars in her house tipped over or broke in some way. Maybe they were leaky and they leaked out. Perhaps they consumed in her household more than they had brought. They were over-consuming and she had to go get some more. Maybe she just simply liked going to get the water at that time because there were less people hitting the water hole. I mean, maybe that's the convenient time of the day for her to go and do it. I can think of a number of reasons why she can come at noon rather than throw her character under the bus when the Bible doesn't tell me one thing or another about her reputation in town or her being of ill repute. The point I'm trying to make here, and it's kind of the similar point that we have with Nicodemus and Nicodemus coming at night in John chapter 3, is it's a little bit of a litmus test on our own judgmental attitudes. For we can know little from the text itself, but too many people are willing to just fill in details that we just don't have. Additionally, and I'm going to throw this out there, if she were truly a person of ill repute in town, in this male-dominant society, why would the people in that town believe the word of a woman, much less a sketchy woman? Take a look at John 36, John chapter 4, verses 36 through 42. John 4:36 through 42. I'll have it on screen for you. I'll say 39 through 42. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with him, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. And they said to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world." The point is, if this woman was so trashy, such a social outcast that she had to go at an odd part of the day because she couldn't be around other women because of the stain of her sinful life, then why are the towns so easy to believe her word when she comes to them talking about, "I've seen the Messiah"? You would think in that particular situation, you'd be like, "Shut up, lady. You need to just leave. You need to take your trashy self back home." But that's not what they did. They believed, and then they went to go here. So it definitely calls into question those who would want to throw her under the bus. And you might say, "Oh, but it says that she's had several husbands, and the man that she lives with now is not her husband." Well, that doesn't necessarily mean she's living in an adulterous relationship. She could be living with a relative. It's any one of a number of reasons why that could come to pass. When Ruth and Boaz got married, where did Naomi live? With them. I mean, it could be a similar situation. Who knows? You don't have to jump to the worst case scenario in order to paint her into a situation to make her, a bad person. I don't know anything about her. Here's the important point. The woman's shock to Jesus' request. Jesus said, "Give me a drink." And she is flabbergasted that a Jew would ask her to do anything with regards to, supplying his needs and what have you in a non-market transaction situation. The Jews could buy, supplies from Samaritans in the marketplace and things of that nature, but this is a private sort of a get-together here at the well. So it makes it a little more intimate rather than just a market transaction. And I think her shock at Jesus' request is wholly appropriate based on the cultural baggage and the issues between the Jews and the Samaritans. And John interjects in verse 9 of chapter 4 this editorial comment after her shocked, response, so that any Gentile readers or those who are not familiar with the Jew-Samaritan relationships would understand. And it just says, "For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." So my question is, why is this the case? Why did the Jews specifically not have dealings like this with the Samaritans? And also, by extension, where did the Samaritans come from? They're not mentioned by name in the Old Testament. They suddenly show up for the first time in the Gospel of Matthew, chronologically. So the answer to these questions, when we consider the background, they're going to lend power to Jesus' revelation of his messiahship, if that's a real word, to this Samaritan woman. And the remainder of our time tonight, I want to take a look at Samaritan-Jew relationships and where they come from and why it got so bad, so you can understand the context and what makes Jesus' words to her so remarkable. So let's consider this Jewish-Samaritan context here with regards to the conflict that you see and things of that nature. So let's consider how the Samaritans, first off, are presented in the New Testament. Often negatively, along Jewish cultural expectation lines, but quite often in a positive light in the gospel accounts and in the book of Acts as positive contrast to Jewish callousness towards Jesus and the message of the cross and what have you. When you look at the New Testament, the term Samaritan only appears 10 times in the entire New Testament, mostly in the Gospels and once outside of the Gospels in the book of Acts. In the book of Matthew, it appears only once in a prohibition given to the apostles at the limited commission that they would forbidding them to go out and approach people and approach Samaritans and Samaritan villages and things of that nature in Matthew 10:5. Jesus said, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans." So it was a prohibition to go to them. Don't bring this message to them at this particular point. So that's a negative picture of the Samaritans, and there may be some reasons for that beyond simply Jesus saying, "I've come to bring the message and seek the lost sheep of Israel." At that particular time, it's very possible they could have been accosted by angry Samaritans. So, there's a lot of things that kind of feed into that. In the Gospel of Luke, the term appears in 3 separate accounts, once negatively, but twice positively. More often than not, the Samaritans are presented positively in Luke's Gospel, which is a decidedly Gentile slant to it. The negative mention is in Luke chapter 9, 51 through 56, where Jesus approaches a Samaritan village and then sends some of the apostles into town to make arrangements for supplies, and they are rejected by the Samaritans there and basically ran out. And as a result of that rejection, the apostles desire retribution and ask for the Lord to call fire down upon that town based on their antagonism and probably on the complicated history between Jews and Samaritans. But Jesus, chastises them for that thought. The first positive mention of Samaritans that we find in the Bible is in the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, 29 through 37. And in that particular account, this it upsets cultural norms because in Jewish society, the priest and the Levite would have been respectable people. But in this particular account, they're the callous ones who walk by someone who's in need, and the one who would typically be the person of ill repute or the person who is not an honorable individual is the Samaritan, ends up being the hero in the scenario because he showed love and gave help to his neighbor. Jesus is just trying to demonstrate that anyone in need is our neighbor. It doesn't have to be along racial, ethnic lines, things of that nature. So Samaritans are used in a positive example, positive sense there. And in Luke chapter 17, verses 11 to 19, you see the account of some lepers that Jesus heals, and 9 of them go away, and only one of them come back. And the only one that comes back is a Samaritan who gives thanks to Jesus. And it's implied that the other ones were Jewish, and they went away ungrateful for the blessings that they had received. And the only one who had showed gratitude towards God for what he had done was the Samaritan leper. It was, again, a matter of subverting expectations right there. So twice positively, once negatively. In the Gospel of John, the term appears 5 times. Most of those appearances are in John 4, and that's a positive picture. 4 of those 5 times are in John 4. It's a positive picture of the receptivity of the Samaritans, and it's contrasted in John's Gospel to the lack of receptivity by Orthodox Jews. And it's also used negatively in the Gospel of John as an insult directed towards Jesus, which assails Jesus' own orthodoxy of his teaching and of his ministry. In John 8:48, the Jews answered Jesus, saying, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" So you're basically doing the devil's work, and you're a dirty, filthy, no good Samaritan. They just tried to cut his legs out from under him, and in doing that, trying to discredit anything that he might say, any of his teaching. Of course, they weren't successful in that. So positively and negatively, Samaritan is used there as a byword to insult Jesus. In the book of Acts, the term appears once, but chapter 8 in Acts takes place in Samaria. the town of Samaria, uh, thus, or in the area of Samaria, thus Samaritans, and it speaks again to the admirable receptivity that they have to the gospel. Take a look at Acts chapter 8, verses 4 through 8. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed to them the Christ, and the crowds with one accord paid attention. Now that's in Samaria. The city of Samaria is obviously in Samaria. And the crowds with one accord paid attention to what was being said by Philip, and when they heard him and saw the signs he did, for unclean spirits, crying out with a loud voice, came out of many who had them, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was much joy in that city. And then this chapter ends, as it transitions to the Ethiopian eunuch, by saying, now when they had testified and spoken the word of the Lord, they returned to Jerusalem, preaching the gospel to many villages of the Samaritans. So the point is, the receptivity of the Samaritans is noted often in the gospel accounts and in the book of Acts. And more often than not, Samaritans by the gospel writers are presented in a positive light rather than in a negative light. So from these accounts, we see the New Testament writers hinting at the inclusiveness of the gospel by showing the Samaritans often as models of receptivity, and they act as foils to unbelief. So it's really kind of interesting. You have the, in John chapter 3, you have the picture of the contrast between belief and unbelief. And in the next chapter, chapter 4, you see the picture of unexpected belief or belief in unexpected areas, like the Samaritan area. So, in recording this particular curious exchange, it really shines a light on the prevailing attitude of the Jews and the Samaritans towards each other. And this mutual antagonism is rooted and grounded in the history of the two peoples. So, when you look at where the Samaritans come from, they are first encountered in the Old Testament post-exilic life accounts surrounding Jerusalem's reconstruction in Ezra and Nehemiah. Although they're not mentioned by name as Samaritans, the opponents that troubled Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah were said to have come from the region of Samaria. Ezra chapter 4:17 says, let me just pull that up. Ezra 4:17, the king sent an answer to Rehum the commander and Shimshai the scribe and the rest of their associates who live in Samaria and the rest of the province beyond the river, greeting. Now these were the people who had obtained this cessation order to bring against the Jews who were trying to rebuild the temple, and they're been told to stop. Now, go down to Nehemiah 4:2, and you see, and he said in the presence of his brothers and the army of Samaria, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones? As you can see the idea that Sanballat was a crumb who was trying to stop the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, and he is said to be a man of Samaria and brought an army from Samaria. So here are Samaritans, although they're not known as that in the Old Testament, and they're pictured as obstructionists to the Jewish attempts at reconstruction and the reestablishment of the people in the land of Palestine there. Now, where did these Samaritans come from? They weren't there whenever they were taken into captivity, but they come back and suddenly they're troubling, the Jews whenever they come back from captivity and being a thorn in their side. The answer is found in the Old Testament in 2 Kings chapter 17. And it deals specifically, and they come specifically from the way Assyrians dealt with their practice of dealing with conquered lands and conquered people, and how they controlled these areas that they took over. The northern kingdom of Samaria, also known as Israel, fell to Assyrian forces in 722 BC. The Assyrians had the practice of, in order to prevent rebellion in these areas that were just conquered, they would mix the populations by exiling one ethnic group, say the Jews in the northern kingdom, and replacing it with another ethnic group, say people from Assyria or another conquered people, and bringing them into the land. 2 Kings 17:24 puts it this way. And the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. And these incoming pagans, they did not know God or the people of God per se, or the God that the people of Israel served. And God allowed them to experience his wrath in the form of lion attacks. Look at verse 26. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you have carried away and placed in the cities of gold do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are killing them, because they do not know the law of the land. So upon learning of this danger, the Assyrian ruler ordered that a priest be sent to teach them, as it says in verse 27, quote, the custom of the God of the land. Now, this priest is a priest that came from Samaria, or the northern kingdom here. So he was a Jew that was still left in the land, but he was probably a compromising Jew who was a priest perhaps at either Dan or Bethel, which were the two places of worship in the northern kingdom, both of them tied to the idolatrous practices of Jeroboam I, all the way back at the beginning of the split with the golden calves that represented Yahweh and all of that stuff. And that could explain why they readily accepted this syncretism, is what they call it. It's basically the religious blending of various beliefs to form this sort of hybrid religion. What ended up happening is they ended up covering their bets and serving both the Lord and their imported false gods. Let's look at verses 17, chapter 17, 29 through 33, and verse 41. But every nation still made gods of its own, and put them in the shrines of the high places that the Samaritans had made. Every nation in the cities in which they lived. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth. The men of Cuth made Nergal, and the men of Hamath made Ashima. And the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, and the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of the Sepharvaim. They also feared the Lord and appointed for themselves all sorts of people as priests and of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. So they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods after the manner of the nations from whom they had been carried away. And then in verse 41, so these nations feared the Lord and served their carved images. Their children did likewise, and their children's children, as their fathers did, so they do to this day. And that so they do to this day is, to this day, according to the writer of 2 Kings. But they did it to the day that Jesus was also, to Jesus' time, and they're still pictured as a hybrid form that still worships on Mount Gerizim, where their ancient temple was once located. So it was they had a lot of problems, and this religious impurity was known by Israel's leaders at that time, and the efforts of the Samaritans to approach and to help in the rebuilding of the temple and the reinstitution of pure religion in Israel, is one of the reasons why they were, basically rejected, and and as a result of the rejection and their participation in that by, the leaders of Israel at that particular time, that animosity between what would be the Samaritans and the Jews began. And this religious dispute over theological purity led to a lot of political and religious animosity between the Jews of Judah and the dwellers in Samaria that continued through the intertestamental period and extended into Jesus' day, and often was manifested in violent activities towards one another. Here's just some quick things that have happened. Now, tell me, if you were a Jew, how would you feel knowing that these people who they claimed to serve Yahweh, but they did it at the wrong place, and they mixed it with the worship of idolatry? I mean, that's one of the reasons Judah was sent away into captivity, and they came back, a pure nation, disciplined as a result of it. Now, here are their neighbors who are, really detestable in their eyes for doing that same thing, and they're demonstrating acts of violence towards them. So, during the reign of a Greek ruler by the name of Antiochus III the Great, the Samaritans sold the Jews into slavery. Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, noted this. He said, quote, "Now at this time the Samaritans were in a flourishing condition and much distressed the Jews, cutting off parts of their land and carrying off slaves, Jewish slaves." So they were encroaching upon Jewish territories, taking their land, and selling their people off into slavery. That's not going to engender much brotherly love and support. During the reign of the despot, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, if you remember my Daniel classes from way back when, he was the Greek ruler who tried to stamp out Judaism. He defiled the temple, and he set a sacrifice to Zeus in the temple and defiled it in Jerusalem. And he tried to burn and get rid of all Hebrew scriptures, and he prohibited the observance of feasts and things of that nature, and observances of the law and punishment of death. So many things that he did. Well, this Antiochus IV, the Samaritans aligned themselves with that Greek ruler and repudiated all connections with Israel at that time so they could find safety. And they even went so far as to rededicate their temple, which was located on Mount Gerizim, to the worship of Jupiter, or, that's a major deal right there, Zeus. 2 Maccabees chapter 6 verses 1 and 2 put it this way: "Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their ancestors and no longer live by the laws of God, also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and call it the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to call the one in Gerizim the temple of Zeus, the friend of strangers, as did the people who lived in that place." So there's a contrast being made right there between, the Jewish stand and the Samaritan stand, and the Jews, were rebelling against that idea violently, and the Samaritans were embracing it to avoid violence. And it caused a revolt, and during this revolt, the Maccabean revolt, the Samaritans aligned themselves against Judah, against the Jews. But this isn't a one-sided thing. In 130 BC, a Jewish leader by the name of John Hyrcanus, who was a leader at that time after the overthrow of Antiochus and the Jews get their own country back and they're self-ruling for a while, went and destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim in what is the ultimate act of desecration for a temple. And it was never rebuilt despite worship going on there even to this day. They never rebuilt it. So when the Samaritan woman in John 4 talks about, "We worship the Lord on this mountain," they're worshiping in the ruins of the temple that John Hyrcanus, the Jew, destroyed in 130 BC. Hyrcanus' own sons around 113 to 105 BC, destroyed the city of Samaria itself after a year-long siege. Shechem was also razed. And in the writings and the attitudes of the Jews, the Samaritans were often regarded as foolish people. And one writer went so far as to say, I abhor them in my heart. So they were abhorred by Orthodox Judaism. But relatively fresh on the mind of the Jews in Jesus' day, these things that I mentioned before happened hundreds of years before Jesus. How about something that happened during Jesus' lifetime that would inform, some of the reason that the apostles had distaste for the Samaritans and things of that nature? They often were attacked on the way. The Jews were often attacked in those days on the way to Jewish feasts by Samaritans. And in fact, Josephus notes that that there was one account where there was like hundreds of Jews that were killed by Samaritans and bushwhacked at a village as they were passing through, heading to worship from Galilee to Jerusalem. But one event took place in about 6 or 7 AD. So during the life of Jesus, the early life of Jesus, it took place at the very beginning of the Passover. Samaritans entered the temple complex as the gates were opened on the beginning of Passover, and they spread human bones over the outer courtyard to defile the temple in an effort to disrupt the Jewish worship and the practice and the observance of the Passover. And Josephus put it this way in Antiquities, Book 8, Chapter 2. He said, as Coponius, who we told you was sent along with Cyrenius, was exercising his office of procurator and the governing of Judah, the following accidents happened. As the Jews were celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which we call the Passover, it was customary for the priests to open the temple gates just after midnight. When, therefore, those gates were first opened, some of the Samaritans came privately into Jerusalem and threw about dead men's bodies in the cloisters, on which account the Jews afterwards excluded them out of the temple, which they had not used to do at such festivals, and on other accounts also they watched the temple more carefully than they had formerly done. So, a horrible desecrating act that would still be fresh in the minds. Listen, there are, you're only talking 20 years. You're not even talking 20 years after that. Maybe 20, 22, 23 years after this. There are still people. Things stay in people's mind. Ask a Vietnam vet what they think of Jane Fonda. Even today, you will get utter disgust from them because of her anti-U.S., anti-war statements that she made and the photo ops with the Viet Cong. That is the kind of hatred that sticks with a person over time. And this is the same period of time frame here. We're talking within the lifetime of many of our college students from that particular event. So it's in the midst of this sort of tumultuous context here that Jesus addresses the Samaritan woman, and he reveals with clarity for the first time that he was the Messiah. And I think that's a remarkable moment. Despite all the cultural baggage, he approaches her. He initiates the conversation. He piques her interest in spiritual things. He speaks to her of true worship, true sustenance, spiritual things versus physical things. He calls her out on, he challenges her beliefs on things. And then he reveals himself in a very special way, saying, I am he of whom you speak. We know that the Messiah will come. So it's a really interesting picture. So next week, we're going to consider the exchange between Jesus and the Samaritan woman and the impact that it had on her heart and on the people in that town. And I hope you will tune in. I hope this kind of helps you understand, you know, that, how Jesus operated, that he didn't allow these things to get in the way of speaking to the needs of people. And oftentimes we can get bogged down in cultural baggage. We live in a country right now where people are more apt to judge you and write you out of their life on the basis of who you voted for than at any other time in this country. The division is palpable, not unlike the division between the Samaritans and the Jews, yet Jesus reaches beyond that and speaks to a universal need. And I think that's something that's important for all of us to remember. So join me again next week, and we'll look at that. I appreciate you tuning in, and I'll catch you later. All right? Have a good evening.